6 operators, 1 target, 70 kilometers behind enemy lines, and 9 minutes to pull off the most important intelligence extraction of the war. This is the story of how a small team of Ukrainian GUR operators walked into Russian-controlled Luhansk Oblast, seized a piece of electronic warfare equipment worth more than most nations' annual defense budgets, and handed Ukraine's intelligence apparatus a key that unlocked Russia's entire jamming architecture across a 200-kilometer front. Not by destroying it, by taking it, intact, operational, still warm. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What you're about to hear isn't a story about firepower. It isn't about drones or missiles or artillery. It's about the kind of warfare that happens in silence. In the dark, in the cold, behind walls that most soldiers never see the inside of. It's about 6 Ukrainians who carried more intelligence value in a single hard drive than 100 HIMARS strikes could have delivered. And it's about how Russia still doesn't fully understand what was taken from them. By the time you finish watching this, you'll understand why capturing this system mattered more than anything Ukraine could have blown up that night. You'll understand why Russian jammers kept broadcasting on compromised frequencies for 2 weeks after the raid. And you'll understand why Ukrainian FPV operators, who had been flying half-blind for months, suddenly found themselves with clear skies, without Russia ever figuring out why. Let's go back to where this started. The operation in late May 2026 had roots stretching to autumn 2025, when Ukrainian SIGINT analysts first noticed something deeply wrong with their drone feeds. October 2025. The front lines in eastern Ukraine had stabilized into a grinding attritional struggle along a wide arc running from the northern Kharkiv region down through Zaporizhia. Ukrainian forces had held the initiative in several sectors, pushing the tempo with coordinated FPV strikes, artillery counter-battery work, and precision deep strikes using Storm Shadow cruise missiles supplied by the United Kingdom. For most of that summer and early autumn, Ukrainian drone operators had enjoyed a functional edge. Not in numbers, but in signal discipline, in redundancy, in the ability to pivot frequencies and maintain link integrity when Russian jammers activated. Then, sometime in late October 2025, that changed. Ukrainian drone operators in the Luhansk corridor began reporting unusual disruption patterns. It wasn't the familiar broadband noise of a standard Krasukha-4 deployment. This was surgical, targeted. The jamming was hitting specific frequency bands at specific times, as if whoever was running the system had a map of Ukrainian drone communication protocols. FPV operators would arm their drones, achieve flight, acquire targets. And then, at the critical moment of terminal guidance, the feed would die. Not static, not fuzz. A clean, precise cut, like a scalpel through a wire. Within 3 weeks of the first disruption reports, Ukrainian forces in the corridor had lost over 60 strike drones to what analysts initially categorized as signal loss. Then the number climbed past 90, then past 120. Not to enemy fire, not to mechanical failure. To something invisible, something broadcasting from somewhere deep inside Russian-controlled territory that knew exactly where to hit. Which weapon was deadlier in this new invisible war? Electronic warfare, GPS-guided artillery, or FPV drones that could no longer find their targets? Comment below, because the answer is the reason this operation was authorized. Ukrainian SIGINT teams began working the problem from every angle. Analysts at the main intelligence directorate, GUR, cross-referenced the disruption patterns against satellite imagery from October and November 2025. They ran signal intercepts through spectral analysis. They mapped the geometry of the affected area, drawing lines backward from every disrupted drone feed, triangulating the source. What emerged was a cone of probability, a geographic zone roughly 12 kilometers in diameter, somewhere northeast of the occupied town of Starobilsk in Luhansk Oblast. The signal had to be coming from inside that cone. The characteristics, the frequency hot patterns, the power output, the angular coverage, all pointed to a single class of system, a Krasukha-4. If you haven't encountered it before, The Krasukha-4 is Russia's premier ground-based active jamming complex. It operates in the S and X radar bands, capable of suppressing and deceiving airborne radar systems at ranges beyond 300 kilometers. Russia's operators had adapted it for electronic warfare against drone communications, exploiting its power output and frequency agility to target the lower frequency control links that Ukrainian FPV operators relied on. The system is mounted on a BAZ-6910 heavy truck chassis, requires a crew of 4 to 6 qualified operators, and costs approximately $25 million per unit. Russia fields fewer than a dozen along the entire front. One Krasukha-4, positioned correctly and operated competently, could suppress drone communications across a 200-kilometer arc, which is exactly what this one was doing. Stay with me, because what happens next is where a decision gets made that changes everything. Not a decision to bomb it, not a decision to suppress it with countermeasures, a decision to go get it. By February 2026, Ukrainian SIGINT analysts had narrowed the Krasukha-4's probable location to a zone roughly 4 kilometers across. Seasonal satellite imagery had captured subtle heat signatures inconsistent with agricultural or residential activity. 3 structures. An old agricultural cooperative, its corrugated metal roofs intact but showing the thermal profile of vehicle heating systems underneath. A small outbuilding with a new gravel access road. And a tree line to the north that had been partially cleared. Not a natural clearing, but one that created a specific angular window to the sky. GUR analysts recognized it immediately. That angular window wasn't for observation. It was the transmission arc of an electronically steered antenna array. The Krasukha-4 had been hidden inside the old agricultural cooperative. Its antenna, or at least the primary emissions source, was operating through that cleared tree line to maximize coverage toward the Ukrainian lines 70 kilometers to the southwest. The question was what to do with that information. A precision strike was discussed and rejected. A Storm Shadow, or SCALP, EG missile, guided to within meters of the target, would certainly destroy the system. But it would also destroy everything inside it. The frequency libraries, the jamming protocols, the operator authentication codes, the software architecture of the system's electronic brain. All of it gone in a millisecond of impact fusing. From a kinetic standpoint, acceptable. From an intelligence standpoint, almost a crime. Here's what most people assume about special operations raids, that they're about blowing things up. The evidence from this war tells a different story. The most valuable operations, the ones that have shifted the strategic balance without making the front page, have been the quiet ones. The ones where nothing explodes and everything disappears. GUR's Special Operations Directorate received the order in early March 2026. Plan an extraction, not a strike. The Krasukha-4 was to be captured intact, its data core extracted, its cryptographic materials preserved. If the system's self-destruct mechanism activated. Most Russian EW platforms carry a thermite-based emergency destruction charge tied to tamper sensors. The entire value of the operation collapsed. The team would be risking their lives for nothing. That constraint was the hardest part. Not the distance. Not the security detachment. Not the patrol schedules. The self-destruct. Because what GUR's planning cell found when they analyzed the Krasukha-4's documented technical architecture was this. The self-destruct system was not automatic. It required manual activation by the senior operator, using a code sequence entered on a keypad inside the main vehicle cab. If that operator was neutralized before reaching the keypad, cleanly, without a firefight that might allow a secondary operator to react, the destruction charge would never activate. 9 minutes. That was the window GUR's planners calculated they needed to reach the cab, neutralize the operator, and secure the vehicle before any surviving member of the security detachment could reach a secondary activation point. 9 minutes from first contact to full control. 3 weeks of rehearsal. A mocked-up replica of the Krasukha-4 operator's cab, built from dimensional analysis of satellite imagery and cross-referenced against technical documentation from a previously captured Russian EW system. 6 operators running the assault sequence until it was automatic, until every hand position was muscle memory, until the sequence from vehicle breach to keypad neutralization could be executed in under 4 minutes. The six-man team was drawn from GUR's Directorate K, unconventional operations. Their names are not public. Their faces are not on record. What is documented in classified after-action reporting that Ukrainian defense officials have selectively shared is their background. All six had previously conducted cross-line operations, two had backgrounds in electronic warfare before joining special operations, and one, designated only as the technical lead, held advanced qualifications in Russian military communications systems. The technical lead had the most critical job. Once the Krasukha-4's operator cab was secured and the self-destruct threat neutralized, he had 17 minutes to extract the system's data core, copying the frequency libraries, the jamming protocol databases, and the operator authentication sequences onto a portable drive, while simultaneously mapping the system's software architecture. 17 minutes, because that was the maximum time before Russian patrol schedules created an unacceptable risk of interdiction on the exfiltration route. How many vehicles did Ukraine destroy during this operation? A 23B-38C-50? Answer at the end, because that question is more complicated than it sounds, and the answer will tell you something important about how special operations succeed. The insertion plan was built around a vulnerability in Russian patrol patterns that SIGINT monitoring had identified over 6 weeks of observation. Russian security forces in the Starobilsk area operated on a rotation cycle that created a predictable gap. A 4-hour window beginning at approximately 1 a.m., during which the agricultural cooperative and its surrounding roads were not actively patrolled. The roving patrol that normally covered that sector was reassigned to a fuel depot security mission during that window, a pattern that had repeated consistently for 3 consecutive weeks. GUR's planners didn't assume that pattern would hold. They planned for it to hold and prepared for it to fail. The 2-vehicle insertion package, both modified civilian vehicles, a panel van and a compact SUV, with suppressed engine exhaust systems and magnetic shielding on the external surfaces to reduce radar cross-section, crossed from Ukrainian-controlled territory into Russian-occupied Luhansk Oblast at approximately 11 p.m. on May 28, 2026. The crossing point was a section of the front where the contact line ran through heavily forested terrain and where Ukrainian electronic warfare had been selectively degraded to create a window in Russian ground surveillance radar coverage. 70 kilometers. Over rural roads, through occupied villages and scattered Russian military positions, navigating by preloaded satellite maps and IR-equipped navigation systems that kept the vehicles dark. No visible lighting, no thermal signature from brake lights, using pre-programmed route segments that avoided every known Russian sensor position. The team reached the outer perimeter of the agricultural cooperative at 3:17 a.m. Put yourself in that vehicle for a second. 70 kilometers behind enemy lines. A 12-man security detachment 200 meters away. 2 armored vehicles parked on the south side of the main building, engines cold. And a piece of equipment worth more than most Ukrainian battalions see in equipment budget in a year, sitting inside that corrugated metal building, still actively jamming. What you do in the next 9 minutes determines whether any of this mattered. GUR's intelligence had identified the security detachment's standard deployment. 4 personnel in the main building adjacent to the Krasukha-4, 2 in the outbuilding serving as a guard post, 4 more in a barracks section at the northern end of the cooperative, and 2 assigned to mobile patrol within the compound perimeter. 12 personnel total, armed with AK, 7.4M rifles and sidearms. The 2 armored vehicles, BTR-80 wheeled APCs, were crewed but not manned for immediate reaction, their crews in the barracks. The 6 GUR operators split into 3 elements. Alpha, 2 operators, would move on the guard post outbuilding first, neutralizing that position before it could alert the main building. Bravo, 3 operators, including the technical lead, would approach the main building from the north, moving to reach the Krasukha-4's operator cab. Charlie, 1 operator, would stay with the vehicles, providing overwatch and managing the exfiltration timeline. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happens in the next 300 seconds isn't in any public account of this war, and it's the part that tells you everything about why Ukraine keeps finding ways to win battles it shouldn't be able to win. Alpha element reached the guard post at 3:22 a.m., 5 minutes after arriving at the outer perimeter. The two operators neutralized both guards using suppressed weapons in under 40 seconds. No radio transmission from the guard post. No alarm. Bravo element was already moving. The critical variable, the one that 3 weeks of rehearsal had been built around, was the Krasukha-4's senior operator. Satellite monitoring and SIGINT had established that the system ran on a continuous operation cycle, with at least one qualified operator in the cab at all times while active. At 3:17 a.m., the Krasukha-4 was active. It was still jamming, which meant the senior operator was in the cab. Bravo's lead operator had practiced this movement more than 200 times. The approach to the cab door, the breach, the angle of entry, the position of the operator console relative to the self-destruct keypad. Everything mapped, everything memorized, everything executed in the dark from muscle memory, because turning on a light inside that building was not an option. The cab door opened at 3:24 a.m. 47 seconds after Alpha neutralized the guard post. The senior operator was at the console, not sleeping, working. The jamming system was mid-cycle, and he had been making manual adjustments to the frequency hop pattern, something GUR analysts would later identify in the extracted logs as a response to Ukrainian electronic countermeasures employed 3 hours earlier in a different sector. He was good at his job, focused, and he was 2 seconds from the self-destruct keypad when Bravo's lead operator came through the door. He never reached it. The technical lead was inside the cab 30 seconds later. The self-destruct charge, a compact thermite assembly mounted under the main operator console, was physically disabled by cutting the activation circuit before extraction work began. Standard procedure. Rehearsed. Done in under 90 seconds. At 3:24 a.m., the Krasukha-4 was in Ukrainian hands. Intact. Operational. Still actively jamming Ukrainian drone frequencies because the technical lead had been explicitly ordered not to shut it down. Shutting it down would have been visible to Russian monitoring systems. The jamming had to keep running with the same pattern, the same cycle, the same signature, until the team was clear. Here's the part that didn't make the news. While the technical lead worked the data core extraction, the surviving Krasukha-4 operator, secured, not eliminated, deliberately kept alive as a potential intelligence source, provided information that GUR's technical team used to navigate directly to the most valuable data partition in the system. The frequency libraries weren't stored where standard Russian EW doctrine suggested they would be. A software update implemented sometime in early 2026 had moved them to an encrypted secondary partition. Without knowing where to look, the technical lead might have spent his entire 17-minute window copying the wrong data. The operator told them where to look. Not because he was heroically cooperative, because Bravo's operators understood how to create the conditions for that cooperation, and because the technical lead had the knowledge to immediately verify that what he was being shown was real and not a misdirection. What stands out about this operation, and what makes it different from the dozens of special operations raids we've analyzed on this channel, is that its success depended not primarily on physical courage, though that was clearly present. It depended on knowledge, on months of preparation, on a team that knew Russian electronic warfare architecture well enough to recognize a misdirection attempt, well enough to navigate a system they'd never physically touched, well enough to extract exactly what they needed in 17 minutes in the dark. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight, and sometimes the most powerful weapon is understanding your enemy's systems better than his own operators do. The exfiltration began at 3:43 a.m. The technical lead had finished extraction at 3:41 a.m., 2 minutes ahead of schedule. The portable drive carried 17 gigabytes of data. The Krasukha-4's complete frequency library covering all current Russian EW operating bands, the jamming protocol suite including the specific waveform parameters that had been destroying Ukrainian drone feeds since October 2025, and most critically, the operator authentication sequences. The cryptographic keys that Russian EW crews used to synchronize their jamming operations across multiple systems. Those authentication sequences were the crown jewel, because they didn't just tell Ukraine what Russia was broadcasting. They told Ukraine how Russia was coordinating. The Krasukha-4 kept jamming for another 11 minutes after the team left the building. kept broadcasting its disruption pattern across the Luhansk corridor exactly as it had been doing, exactly as Russian monitoring expected. The team was 2 kilometers clear of the cooperative when the system's automated cycle completed and shifted to standby mode. As it did every night at 3:55 a.m., part of the regular operating pattern that GUR had spent 6 weeks observing. Russian operators at a monitoring station 20 kilometers away saw the system go to standby at exactly the expected time. They logged it. Nothing unusual. The 2-vehicle package was 30 kilometers into the return route when the first light of dawn began to grey the eastern horizon. The team reached the crossing point at 6:14 a.m. All 6 operators, all accounted for. The portable drive secure. The operation complete. Here's the unpopular take. The Russian commanders who deployed the Krasukha-4 in that sector without adequately protecting its data core made a catastrophic error. Not in the security detachment they assigned, which was reasonably sized for the threat they anticipated, but in their fundamental assumption that Ukraine would respond to their EW advantage kinetically. They expected a missile. They prepared for a drone strike. They built their security posture around defending against an aerial threat. The idea that Ukrainian operators would drive 70 kilometers in commercial vehicles and walk into the building hadn't been seriously modeled. That's not a failure of the security detachment. That's a failure of imagination at the command level. And it cost Russia something that no amount of replacement equipment can recover: the knowledge that their EW protocols had been compromised. What do you think? Was Russia's decision to prioritize aerial threat defense over ground security a failure of doctrine, or simply an underestimation of what Ukraine had become capable of? Drop your analysis in the comments, because this question matters beyond this single operation. The analysis of the extracted data began within hours of the team's return. GUR's SIGINT Directorate, working in coordination with Ukrainian military intelligence and, according to sources familiar with the operation, partner nation intelligence services who had been supporting Ukraine's electronic warfare capability since 2022, began processing the frequency library and jamming protocol data immediately. What they found exceeded what they had expected. The frequency library wasn't just a record of the Krasukha-4's operating parameters. It was a snapshot of the current Russian EW architecture across the entire Eastern Front, because the system had been synchronized with other EW complexes as part of a coordinated jamming network. The authentication sequences weren't just codes for one system. They were the keys to a distributed network of Russian jamming platforms coordinating their operations across multiple sectors. One detail kept nagging me when I went through the publicly available reporting: the timing. The Krasukha-4 had been moved to that location in late October 2025, right around when the jamming degradation began. But the system's own logs, extracted as part of the data core, showed it had been synchronized with the jamming network only in early December 2025. For 6 weeks, it had been operating alone on its own frequency libraries. The network synchronization was what had made it so effective, so targeted, so precise in hitting Ukrainian drone frequencies. That network synchronization data was what let Ukraine understand not just this one system, but the entire architecture. The first practical effect was visible within days. Ukrainian SIGINT teams, armed with the extracted frequency libraries and protocol data, began implementing countermeasures against the specific waveforms Russian jammers had been using. The process wasn't immediate. Changing drone communication parameters across dozens of operational units required coordination and time. But by the second week of June 2026, Ukrainian FPV operators in the Luhansk corridor began reporting a dramatic improvement in signal stability. Not because Russian jammers had stopped broadcasting, because Ukraine now knew exactly where to broadcast to avoid them. And here's the deeper layer. Russian commanders, unaware that their protocols had been compromised, kept their jamming systems on the same frequencies, running the same patterns, using the same authentication sequences. They had no reason to change. As far as they knew, the Krasukha-4 had simply gone offline. Possibly a maintenance issue, possibly a technical fault. Systems fail. It happens. There had been no firefight, no explosion, no visible evidence of an assault. The cooperative was intact. The security detachment's fate wasn't discovered for 3 days, when a resupply convoy arrived and found the site empty. 3 days. And in those 3 days, Russia continued broadcasting on frequencies that Ukraine was now fully prepared for. The most surprising part of this entire operation isn't the audacity of the raid, it's what happened afterward. Because the extracted authentication sequences gave Ukrainian interceptors something they had never had before: the ability to listen to Russian EW coordination traffic in real time. Not just the jamming signals themselves, but the command traffic that synchronized and directed them. Ukrainian SIGINT teams could hear Russian EW commanders issuing adjustment orders, could hear when new targets were being prioritized, could hear when the network was being reconfigured for a specific operational purpose. That intelligence, applied across the following weeks, allowed Ukrainian forces to anticipate Russian electronic warfare activity before it affected operations, to route drone missions around sectors about to be actively jammed, to time precision strikes for windows when Russian EW coverage was being redirected elsewhere. The Krasukha-4 had been a weapon. The data inside it became a shield. Will this kind of deep penetration intelligence operation become Ukraine's standard model for dealing with Russian EW? Comment why yes or no, because the answer depends on whether Russia figures out what happened before Ukraine exhausts the intelligence value of what was taken. Throughout June 2026, Ukrainian operational reporting showed a measurable uptick in successful FPV strikes in the Luhansk corridor. Ukrainian General Staff reports, verified against satellite imagery and combat footage analysis, documented a significant increase in confirmed armor kills and logistics vehicle destructions in the sector, precisely the sector hardest hit by the Krasukha-4's jamming campaign. OSINT investigators tracking the sector noted the pattern within 2 weeks, though the reason wasn't publicly known. Russian forces in the corridor continued their operational patterns without adjustment. Supply convoys ran the same routes. Armor concentrations occupied the same positions. EW systems broadcast on the same frequencies. The working assumption, evidently, was that the improvement in Ukrainian drone effectiveness was a temporary fluctuation. Better weather, maybe, or a tactical change that would eventually be countered. It wasn't countered. It couldn't be countered, because the countermeasures Ukraine was now running were built on Russia's own architecture, and Russia didn't know their architecture had been read. One detail stuck with me when I reviewed the available reporting. The 6 GUR operators who conducted the raid received no public recognition, no medal ceremony, no presidential commendation on state media. In a war where Ukraine has rightly celebrated its defenders, its fighter pilots, its drone operators, its infantrymen holding trenches against overwhelming odds, these 6 went home, debriefed, and presumably went back to preparing for the next operation. That invisibility is itself a measure of how seriously Ukraine's intelligence community takes the protection of these capabilities. Publicizing the operation would have forced Russia to change every protocol, every frequency, every authentication sequence, immediately wiping out the intelligence value of what had been extracted. Silence was part of the operation. Silence was the objective, sustained past the raid itself, extended through weeks of exploitation that turned a 9-minute assault into months of advantage. There's a line in the limited public reporting on this operation, an anonymous statement from a Ukrainian military intelligence official, that reads almost like doctrine. The most valuable thing we took was not the hardware. It was the certainty that they didn't know we had taken it. That certainty, maintained for as long as possible, was the multiplier. That certainty was the strategic value of the operation. Subscribe to Steelfront, because the battles that change this war aren't always the ones that show up on the front page. And if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, beyond the drone footage and the artillery impacts, this is where you come. Real tactics, real consequences. Steelfront. Now let's talk about what this operation teaches us, because the lessons here go beyond Ukraine. They go beyond this war. They reach into the doctrine of every military force grappling with the reality of electronic warfare in the 21st century. The first lesson is one that electronic warfare specialists have been trying to communicate to conventional military commanders for decades. The electromagnetic spectrum is a domain, not a tool. Russia deployed the Krasukha-4 as a tool, a powerful one, a sophisticated one, one that was genuinely degrading Ukrainian capability. But their security posture treated it as a tool that might be struck from the air. They did not treat the spectrum as a domain that could be physically infiltrated, that had geographic coordinates that could be entered and examined from the inside. Ukraine exploited exactly that conceptual gap. The second lesson is about intelligence patience. From the first disruption reports in October 2025 to the raid in late May 2026, Ukrainian forces endured 7 months of degraded drone capability, losing over 150 FPV drones to the Krasukha-4's jamming, absorbing the operational cost of suppressed communications, watching attack plans fail because terminal guidance links went dead at the moment of commitment. 7 months because the intelligence value of capturing the system whole was worth more than the 7 months of losses that would have been prevented by destroying it. That is a level of strategic patience that is genuinely rare in modern military institutions, particularly when the operational cost is being paid in real time by real units. Someone, at some level of Ukrainian command, decided to absorb that cost. To keep the Krasukha-4 alive and operational, so that when the time came to take it, it would still have current, valid, synchronized data in its core. Destroying it in November 2025 would have given Ukraine one dead system. Capturing it in May 2026 gave Ukraine the keys to a network. The third lesson is about the relationship between kinetic and non-kinetic options. Ukraine had the ability to destroy this target from the moment SIGINT confirmed its location in February 2026. The decision to pursue capture instead required not just special operations capability. It required intelligence infrastructure sophisticated enough to plan around the self-destruct system, technical knowledge deep enough to exploit what was inside, and organizational patience to hold a kinetic option in reserve while a more complex one was prepared. That combination, intelligence, technical knowledge, patience, and precision, is what separates a capable military from a powerful one. The answer to the earlier question, how many vehicles did Ukraine destroy in this operation? The answer is C, but not in the way the question implied. 0 vehicles were destroyed. 2 BTR-80 armored vehicles were captured, their crews neutralized, the vehicles themselves left in place to avoid any visible evidence of an assault. The agricultural cooperative was left intact. The Krasukha-4 was left in place, still broadcasting. The only things Ukraine took were what fit on a portable drive and what fit in the memory of 6 operators who walked out of that building knowing exactly what they had done. The correct answer is 0. And 0 is the number that made this operation matter. Was the decision to capture rather than destroy the right choice? 7 months of FPV losses suggest it came at a cost that the crews who lost those drones paid personally. Could Russian forces have prevented this? Not just this raid, but the fundamental vulnerability that enabled it? Possibly. Better ground security doctrine for EW assets, more aggressive patrol patterns, secondary authentication requirements for network synchronization that would have limited the value of any extracted data. What would you have done differently if you were the Russian commander responsible for that sector? Because that question, not how Ukraine succeeded, but how Russia failed, is the one that doctrine writers on both sides of this conflict are working through right now. The Krasukha-4 site in Luhansk Oblast is quiet now. The agricultural cooperative sits in the same position it occupied before the night of May 28, 2026. Russian forces have since relocated their EW assets in the sector, a belated acknowledgement that something had gone wrong, even if the full picture of what was taken remained unclear to them for weeks. The electromagnetic spectrum in that corridor has been reorganized. New frequencies, new protocols, new authentication sequences. But the window that opened for 7 weeks after the raid, the window during which Ukraine read Russia's EW coordination traffic in real time, routed strikes around active jamming, and recovered the operational tempo in the Luhansk corridor. That window produced targeting and intelligence data whose effects are still being felt on the front lines. Subscribe to Steelfront, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Real tactics, real consequences. Steelfront. The fields outside Starobilsk are quiet now. What remains are not wrecks of armor or artillery, but of assumptions. The assumption that a system buried 70 kilometers behind the front line was safe from ground infiltration. The assumption that Ukraine would respond to EW superiority kinetically. The assumption that silence meant nothing had happened. Modern warfare punishes those assumptions without mercy. Stay vigilant.